So Dr. Anders, Professor Alejandro, Professor Steve, thank you very much for joining us in the Humanity 2.0 studio today. So the topic of today's conversation is about cyborgs. So Anders, I want you to kind of get us started here. I think one of the things that would be very useful is to make a distinction between, let's say, a wearable device and, say, what Elon Musk is doing at Neuralink. So would you mind just kind of explaining how those two things are different?
I think the most obvious difference is that you can take off the wearable device, but if something is implanted in you, it's much harder to remove. But being under the skin is probably not the relevant factor here. It's that it's actually a part of you. The word cyborg comes from cybernetic organism, that there is an information flow from the artificial parts to the biological parts and back again. So while I might be using my glasses all day and I see rather badly without them, and I'm thinking about my phone even when I'm not looking into it, that's only a relatively mild form of cyborg connection. But if I had a microchip in my head that was taking my thoughts and maybe processing them and sending them back to me, then I would be much more close to this cyborg vision.
So, based on what Anders has said, Professor Steve, I want to ask you, wearable is something that you can take off, right?
That's right.
As Anders has said, whereas an electronic device implanted in your brain to expand your computational ability is not. Tell me a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it makes a big difference, especially in terms of how people have been conceptualizing cyborg, because I do think most popular conceptions of cyborgs is a kind of man-machine merging of some sort or another. But the interesting thing about wearables, and by the way, I would, if you want to talk about an icon of wearables, Batman. Okay, think about somebody like Batman, who in many respects is the great pioneer of wearability, right? Gives him superpowers, but then he can take them off. And the interesting thing about Batman, and this is where I think the wearability thing matters, is Batman's in a very vexed psychological state all the time because he's a different person when he has the stuff on than when he has the stuff off. And it seems to me that's an interesting dimension of the issue, right? Where there's a sense in which if you've got a wearable, if you're a wearable cyborg and you switch on and off, then there's a sense in which your humanity is kind of made distinct from this other being that you become temporarily for a limited period of time. Whereas if we were talking about, putting in a silicon chip which remains permanently in your brain, is in constant interfacing, let's say with computer networks or something like that, then that would be a kind of an overall transformation. And then there would be kind of an interesting open question about, is this being still human, right? Or is it cyborg in some sense as meaning other than human? You see, so that it seems to me that's where it gets kind of interesting from an existential standpoint.
Professor Alejandro, I want to ask you about that because the church has a reputation for being very protective of what we define as human being, and so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the idea of implanting an electronic device. Would that change the church's understanding of what it makes a human being?
No, I mean, it would really depend on what's the function. So what's the end of this wearable or even implanted technology? So if it's there to somehow make you fully human, so let's say, for example, if you're missing a limb, or for example, you cannot see, and therefore there's an implantation to be able to see, in one sense, is to become fully human. And so I think the church would, in general, would say that would be a positive thing. It would be, but the question really comes is if it's trying to be beyond human. So that would be the real question. So it's trying to enhance you in a way that doesn't make you really human, but it's trying to satisfy some other ego thing. So for example, I mean, in one sense I could compare it to plastic surgery. So there's plastic surgery that's there, for example, if you were in an accident and to reconstruct your face or limbs, etc. So that would be seen as positive to bring you back to full humanity. Whereas if you're doing plastic surgery to enhance body parts so you look better and so on, according to some subjective way of looking at things, then that would be more questionable.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So there's a very popular movie that came out a few years ago with Matt Damon called Elysium, all right, in which he puts on like a big exoskeleton. Mm-hmm. Okay. So obviously, by putting the exoskeleton, he becomes far more powerful than what he is. And so would this be kind of an example of what the church would consider not to be a positive kind of merging of man and machine?
Again, it would be depend why he uses this. So for example, if he uses this for construction and for good things, we'll be fine. But then we have also films where they present that they will create this exoskeleton for war, for example, to enhance the capability of destruction.
Tom Cruise, Edge of Tomorrow.
Tom Cruise, exactly. And so precisely in those scenarios, then, yeah, the church will be more critical.
Where would the church be on Batman?
Oh, on Batman, well, in Batman, I think there's several things. First of all, he already has a trauma before he becomes Batman from his childhood as they kill the parents.
Sure, of course.
But yeah, I will say for Batman, the story is that when he wears the suit, he is somebody else. And so in one sense, there's a little bit of a schizophrenia there.
That's right.
In one sense, to wear the suit continues that schizophrenia. Whereas then we have Tony Stark, who is Iron Man, and so also it's the same technology. But for him, it doesn't create this schizophrenia. It really enhances, in one sense, his own ego. So this is a real alter ego.
So this would
super
definitely
ego.
be wrong as far
and
as
this
the truth.
definitely would be wrong.
But Batman is an interesting case, I would have thought,
I
because
would agree,
it's a
yeah.
more likely scenario in a
It
way.
is more likely scenario.
That's the
yeah,
other thing. It's a
exactly.
more likely scenario in terms of how these wearables are likely to interact with people's psychology.
Well, what I don't understand is if I'm a police officer and I put my utility belt on in the morning, that's essentially what Batman's doing, but putting on a lot more, right? And so, I mean, I think most of us would come to accept that if we have a job to do, and it's an honorable job, we tool ourselves in order to accomplish that job. And that's
But Batman actually, this is the reason why Batman's always in some problematic relationship with law enforcement agencies, because those superpowers actually transcend what's normally allowed within the law.
Exactly, and that's the problem.
Right? And that is a source of, and that's where it gets kind of interesting.
There is also this interesting issue about motivations versus changing who you are. So in the Elysium, the reason the protagonist dons this exoskeleton is to commit some morally very dubious actions in order to help other people. So it makes for a good ethics seminar debate what's going on there. But he doesn't try to become somebody else. He doesn't want to become more than he are. He doesn't truly care about that. And I think that is a really interesting thing to me, since I've been thinking quite a bit about enhancement as something positive. I do think that enlarging our potential can be something good. The tricky part here is, of course, most people want to be more of themselves, but not somebody else. So if you were offered to be so enhanced that you would become a different person, most people would totally turn it down, saying that would not benefit me. Other people might say, yeah, I have some bad sides of my personality. I would like to get around them. And maybe I can do that through therapy, but maybe a microchip is a better way of doing it.
Right. I mean, there's actually a good reference here I want to kind of point back to. Is a movie called Limitless, which came a little while ago, where a person ingests a pill and that opens up basically more of his brain capacity. And his girlfriend at the time, from what I recall, he's a different person when he's using his whole brain. It takes. So I think this is a very important question, right? I think and Elon Musk's Neuralink project, I think, is an example of using technology to accomplish the same thing. If you were to plug in your chip and increase your computational ability of your brain by, let's say, 600%, right? I think it's fair to say that in many ways you're going to be looking at the world differently. Is this a reason we should be concerned?
It depends on how you look at the world differently. If I could just do calculations very, very fast, I would probably be the same nerdy self as I'm currently doing, but very happy because I could do more of the calculations I
It might be
care
in more
about.
advantageous employment situations and so
Yes.
forth. I mean, so there is
But
this
that's
issue of the
aside.
social no, but that's an important point, right? The sociological consequences
Exactly,
of actually allowing this, especially if it's done in a sort of free market environment, and the price for getting these enhancements tend to go up, and so certain people have easier access to it than others. I mean, there's a big potential policy issue here down the road.
Well, let me ask you another question, though. So when I use my iPhone, right, and I have it do a simple calculation, like calculate a tip, essentially I am expanding my computational capability. There's just simply an intermediary involved. So what's the difference between Neuralink and me doing something on my iPhone?
Well, to some degree, I think it's supposed to be direct. And some of the visions behind Neuralink is that it should be seamless. But of course, the Apple engineers are doing their utmost to make their equipment so easy that anybody can use it without thinking.
The whole user-friendliness ethic is basically about seamlessness. So there is a question about whether the fact that the thing is detached from your body or not really matters in the long term, I think.
Exactly. And I mean, I think from a perspective from the church will be the same answer. So it's really what the end is of what the technology, as well as the instruments that we're using for this. So in order for the whole action to be good, the instruments and the end have to be good.
There is, if I may raise, there's a legal issue that has already begun to arise with regard to, let's say, smartphones, especially if you imagine smartphones to a large extent as being a sort of outsourcing of memory. And so a large part of people's identity is actually stored in there, and if they don't have it, it's like they have half their brain damaged, right? I mean, people often joke about this, but there have been legal cases in the United States where, in fact, when police have confiscated smartphones and not returned them and so forth, right? This is not just a matter having to do with property, but has to do with somehow a violation of the person. So there are already precedents, Riley versus California being one of them from a few years ago, where in a sense the smartphone is treated, even though it's physically detached from the human being, is nevertheless considered part of the proper person. And I think that that's kind of one of the things that the law is, there is a kind of cyborg law field that is emerging now. And that's part of what it's looking at, namely in terms of how the new boundaries of the person are going to have to be drawn, allowing for extended minds, distributed minds, and so forth under a common view of a person.
Let me ask you all, whose job is it to actually regulate and come up with these definitions of where a person stops and technology begins?
Well, I think we're all going to give some somewhat different answer. I'm in the philosophy department, and of course, philosophers think that they should be ahead in the queue. But regulators would say, wait a minute, regulation, that's in our name. But deep down, I think the real question is wondering about, well, what would I want to be? What would I want to become? And that's actually up to us. We need to develop kind of virtues in regards to these technologies. If I want to solve an equation, sometimes maybe the virtuous thing is that I just use pen and paper and train my brain. Sometimes that is just stupid because I need the answer. And sometimes the best thing might be if I could connect to the cloud and just download the relevant knowledge from Wikipedia.
And I would say also we cannot forget the sociological aspect of it, and as well as the common good. So we already kind of talked on that. So it's the question of justice. Who will have access? So for example, right now there's the question of we like to pay with credit cards, we like to pay with Apple Pay, etc. But the poor don't have access to that. And now some stores will not even accept cash. And so right now this is being debated, and I think it was in the state of Oregon or Washington that they're setting up a law that every business has to accept cash, because otherwise you're discriminating a whole section of society. So then this whole question of social justice also comes in. Also with enhancement, the question has to be asked, who would have access to all this technology? The people that have money, that can enhance themselves, etc. What about the rest of us, the rest of the population? And so also the moral, it's not just an individual question of morality, but it's also how does this affect the common good in everyone?
I would say, I think that the law is already taking a lead on this. I mentioned the cyborg law example. There are other aspects of this too. And the way the law tends to operate on this, it's obviously these things are being developed precedent by precedent, you might say. But the key thing to focus on is the legal system tends to look at what is people's practices, right? So part of the ruling, for example, that says that the smartphone is part of the proper person has a lot to do with looking at the consequences of the smartphone being confiscated, for an unreasonable period of time and so forth to the person. And so as it were, the way people behave, how they define themselves actually does get used as a benchmark. And I say this because insofar as we want to provide some kind of normative guidance, right? We want people to, we want a kind of an appropriate notion of the person. We've got to get acting now, right? Because it seems to me that the way the law operates is kind of looking what the de facto practice is and then try to make the law around that. So in other words, whatever is becoming, as it were, the statistical norm will probably become the normative norm, right? Unless there is some other kind of concerted effort. I think that's kind of the way things are going, especially given that most of these developments are taking place in a relatively deregulated environment, right? It's one case at a time, certain things happen, and then law gets made.
I think you're speaking to a question that a lot of people have when they hear about technologies like Neuralink, is they're not exactly sure how they feel about it. And I think it's important that there is some kind of voice which informs them, I'm not to say how they should think about it, but at least present to them, various facts and insights which can allow them to make their own opinion. What I worry right now, do you feel that there's enough conversation going on around these technologies?
In general, people love having conversations about these technologies as pure fiction. Batman, Elysium, Terminator, the Borg in Star Trek, all of these images float around when you bring it up. The problem is, of course, these are fictions that have been successful as fictions, but they're not necessarily the most profound ones to think about it. The movie Limitless, for example, had some very interesting thinking about would you actually take a drug that enhanced you but shortened your lifespan and might be driving you mad? That was a good question, but it didn't move as much money as Ironman did.
No, I would say that in one sense, we see it very much on the world of science fiction, in film and culture, but I don't think we necessarily, first of all, not everybody's informed of what is actually the level of technology at this point. Where are we in all these experiments and all this new technology? And so, of course, for some people that's scary because they don't know where are we and where are we going. They just hear rumors. And then, so one thing would be to get the facts out there, and then you can start making some judgments of where we are going. So we're at this level, so okay, what's the next step? Where should we go? That's the time to make the moral decision.
I think, to be honest, I think there is a kind of conversation happening, and I think the result of this conversation, because it's largely unorganized, is it's leading to kind of polarized attitudes, right? So on the one hand, you do have people who are quite afraid and scared and so forth when they see the science fiction stuff, but then you have another group of people watching the same films thinking, hey, I want this, right? I mean, I give a lot of talks talking about cyborgs and all the rest of it. And one of the things I sometimes do is I ask the audience, how many of you would be willing to give up, perfectly working arm to get some kind of prosthetic arm, which in a way gives you new kinds of capabilities, in a sense gives you a kind of whole new limb? You'll get 40% of a crowd that would come to a talk like this saying, sure, I'll try it out. And they sort of dislike the fact that the law prevents you from doing that unless you're officially disabled, right? If you're disabled, then the sky's the limit with regard to prosthetics. Yeah. But otherwise, there are real serious legal regulations against this. And so I do think you're getting a kind of polarized world about this. Some people thinking it's totally scary, and others saying, hey, bring it on. I want to replace all my parts, even if they're working fine.
I think this begs another important question. If I'm willing to sacrifice my arm because a mechanical one provides me new abilities, what does that say about me?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And I think, so Father Alejandro, because you are the priest, I have to ask, is there an existential part of this conversation about cyborgs that we need to be having?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same old ancient debate about who are we? Are we just spirit, or are we bodies only? Are we both spirit and body? So that's the same question here. And so I think what's coming up more and more is that it's kind of the old Platonism and the idea of this kind of, we're really spirit, we're really mind, we're really consciousness. So therefore, the more we can enhance the vessel in which this consciousness is held, that's the future. That's where
exactly
we should
right.
going.
No, that's exactly where I think this is coming from. It's it is a kind of techno-Platonism, basically.
Exactly.
The irony is, I even studied a bit of medical engineering because I wanted to build neural interfaces. And I got so disappointed when I realized this horrible mess the body is. So I came over as kind of techno-Aristotelian instead. Oh dear, we're all this messy integrated stuff. And I still think that becoming cyborgs can be a really great thing. But that will need to deal with a lot of messiness. The cyborg is not going to be pure spirit in some vessel of metal.
Unless Ray Kurzweil gets his way.
Yeah,
right?
He or she is probably going to be hypochondrial, just in the same way I'm always fiddling with my computer trying to update the software because it's not quite working as it should. And I'm realizing there are always weird cross interactions in the whole system. So maybe in the long run we might learn something important existential the hard way by trying to become cyborgs.
Trying to do all that. Yeah. So ultimately for Christianity, for us, would be, is incarnational theology. So in the sense that we are both body and spirit, and that's who we truly are. Yes, with all the flaws and with all the virtues, but that's what also makes us human. And I think if we were able to, take out the consciousness, put it in a machine, we are losing a big part of us, of who we are. Part of that flawness of humanity is what really makes us enduring and what makes us human. And you will become a machine, basically. You'll become more and more that which you are building, I think.
Well, if I could say something in a way, because I obviously don't disagree with what you're saying, but I do think a complicating factor with regard to human history is biomedicine in the modern period, and the way in which our bodies, our longevity, all sorts of aspects of ourselves have been radically transformed, okay, way beyond what the, you might say, the evolutionary endowment of Homo sapiens was, right, from 40,000 years ago. We've made massive improvements and increases and so forth, which the church doesn't deny, it doesn't have anything against, and so it seems, and this is where transhumanism in a way would put the question to the church, namely, what's the problem going the next step, right? Where the next step might be some genetic re-engineering, might be, these kind of silicon implants, right? Might be prosthetics, right? Given that we have allowed ourselves, right, to transform ourselves as much as we have, right, and much of it happening within a relatively short period of time, by the way, right, within the last 150 years, let's say, in terms of doubling life expectancy and getting rid of diseases and all the rest of it, and allowing millions and billions of people to live on the planet. So why can't there not be another kind of significant change of this kind?
Well, I mean, I think part of the thing is, like I was saying in my spirituality class, who is the saint? So the saint in the church is the one that's fully human. And so that's why Christ is Christ also, who is God and human, in the sense that he's the full human. This is what we're supposed to be as human. The problem, because what we call original sin is all this flawness, so we're not fully human right now. That's what we're trying. So I think medicine and technology, etc., has been helping us in some way transform us into more human. And so as long as that's happening, I think pretty much the judgment would be positive. I think is when we're trying to be more than human, then we're going beyond who we are. Now, where is the limit? That's a big question, and that's an existential question, that's a philosophical question. But at one point, like in the case of Darth Vader in Star Wars, he is more machine than human. So when we reach that level, yes, we have broken the limit. We're no longer human. He's more machine than human.
Can I ask one way you might be able to set this criteria that you're suggesting would be if these humanity 2.0 creatures were able to recognize the 1.0 creatures as one of their own, right? Because this is kind of part of the fear that a lot of people have about superintelligence and all these other kind of nightmarish transhumanist scenarios, is that once, a being evolves to a certain level, however, by whatever means, right, they will no longer recognize or respect, right, the beings from which they came. And I'm wondering whether that would be so. In other words, that could be used as a kind of criteria. So in a sense, it's not so important whether the being has reached a certain level of intelligence per se, but rather what is their attitude? How do they relate to those from whom they came? Right, the ones who are still at the lower level.
You can say that maybe you want supersets. So monkeys, they're considering should we become post-monkeys, so-called humans, realize, whoa, with this capability we can get so many bananas. And we humans like bananas too. We are a superset of that, but we also like art and religion. And maybe the post-humans will say, yeah, those are great, but we also like bananas and these other new things. But as long as we can go back.
But I think there's a reason to be afraid. And Homo erectus and Neanderthal would be a good example of that, right? I mean, we haven't always played well in our evolutionary history with other species. We've had a hard time of recognizing their dignity.
See, I do think this is a place where the church can play a very constructive role in an argument where this kind of position isn't held too much. Because I think it's fair to say that within the transhumanist community, it's basically kind of a free market environment, right? And in fact, there's a kind of glorification of speciation. Right, so the idea that humans, that humanity 2.0 isn't just one thing, right? It could be multiple things, and they all go off in their different directions. And if Elon Musk gets his way, each one can have a planet for themselves. And it seems to me that this kind of avoids the realistic question about the differences between the haves and have-nots, which is already quite large in our world, without going through all this stuff, and is probably going to be exacerbated. And so the idea of reasserting a sort of common notion of humanity, even as these changes are taking place, is going to be a very important role, I would think, the natural role for the church.
Exactly, yeah, and again, as Matthew said, the big thing for us, is to protect the human person, so that's the whole. So even the word itself, transhumanism, is already, it's beyond human, something different. So even when, for example, we were talking about artificial intelligence, that they reach a level that they're self-conscious of themselves, does that make them more human or human? No, I would say, it's a whole different being that we would have to deal with that once we, with them as different.
Being human is not so much about having this kind of skin or breathing oxygen. You can be genetically adapted to a life on Mars, and I still think you can think and feel like a human. It might be when you start changing that thinking and feeling, you might start leaving what we might call humanness. Although I think even in a widely divergent post-humanity, if we can still think back, if we still can recognize some shared roots, that might actually be enough.
The one thing I think is interesting about this conversation, though, it seems like a lot of the definition between what is human and what is not is related to utility, right? So I want us to look at that, the purpose of man, right? So let's talk about Neuralink, for instance. Expanding my computational capabilities. Why? Why would that be important? And I think, one of the things I wonder, is it because of the looming presence of artificial intelligence? So I want you to kind of reflect on that a little bit. Share with me your thoughts on that.
So I think there is this naive idea that, oh, we should enhance ourselves so we can always beat the AI. And I don't think that's going to work. And then there is the idea, oh, maybe if you can't beat them, join them. We should merge with the machine and then they're on the winning side. Except that that's also fraught. Who is on the winning side? And so I think there are useful things, like we can actually impart some of our values on the machines to get them to understand what we actually want. But generally, it's of course, you want to enhance things that matter to you in a way that doesn't lose that value. And that takes a lot of virtue, essentially. You need to know how to apply technology in your life.
I would say I'm not so worried about machines actually taking over human beings, because I think in terms of let's put it this way, human brains are very flawed, but they're quite energy efficient, right? And if we were to literally think about designing computers that could do what the human brain can do in terms of how much energy it would take to do it, it's not really feasible. I mean, so
not yet.
Not yet. But the point is that is a serious issue. There's an ecological barrier, I think, with regard to even going down this route until we find out some much more energy efficient ways of doing computation. Let's put it that way. The other thing I would say, and here I would take a little bit of exception to what Anders has said. I actually think there's something quite interesting about the idea of trying to beat the AI. Right? Because in the history of technology, the way in which human beings have always been redefining themselves, right? It's, in a sense what we've been doing. History of technology is about like offloading certain things that the human being would have to do themselves and have a machine do it instead, right? And then humans can do something else instead, okay? And so in a way, it now gets more challenging as we're talking about cognitive tasks, right? Because then what are we going to use our minds for if these machines can do those kinds of things? But I think that's actually a very interesting kind of challenge for the human being.
People have not stopped playing chess despite the chess software.
No, but the point is there are other things that we could be doing. This is the point. And we have always found other things to do that the machine cannot do. And so in that respect, the machine is challenging us. It's challenging us to reassert our humanity all the time.
Well, this is something interesting in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, right? Because, with automation and stuff, they're predicting that there could be some changes in the job market. Now, they're hoping artificial intelligence and things may create new jobs, but obviously some people are not going to be able to retool that quickly. And so there is going to be people with a lot more time on their hands. And what they choose to do with that time, I think, is very important for the species. But I do think that there is always this pressure that with the emerging of man and machine, as has been alluded to earlier, that there will be kind of a new hyperclass of human beings that are able to outcompete for those jobs.
Yeah, and the young. So
right. So what I want to talk about is how do we prevent people that aren't able to actually integrate these new technologies from despair?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. But I mean, I think, first of all, one of the principles that's always there is that everything that is around us, everything that we create especially, so the tools are to serve the human person, not the other way around. So that's a basic principle. So so we can create computers that think faster than we are, etc., to help us in our own tasks and to live life. When we become slaves to the machines, when we become somehow, we lose ourselves, we become also instruments of the machine, that's when we start saying, wait a minute, there's a problem here. And I think that would apply to any kind of technology. If it's serving the human person to become more human, that's fine. When we start becoming slaves, which we're already happening with our technology that we already have, so we don't have to go to the cyborg, that's a big problem. So then, so the question comes, ultimately comes down to the question of love in the sense, do I love myself as I am? I mean, I think a lot of people that fall, for example, for plastic surgery to enhance themselves is because they don't love really themselves. And so a lot of times it says, I just don't, so I want to be something different. I want to enhance myself through technology, through whatever it is, because I don't like who I am. And that's an existential question. And I think that's where the despair comes. But when we are comfortable who we are, when we love ourselves, etc., and we have that self-centeredness in a positive way, I think a lot of these questions kind of get answered by themselves. And so therefore, all technology and the evolution of technology is fine as long as it's serving us in that sense. When we become slaves to them, that's a problem.
One thing I would say about this, and this is where, in a way, one reason why we're in a particular mess with regard to this particular kind of technology, these sort of artificial intelligence enhancement technologies is because of the user-friendliness ethic that's been driving a lot of this stuff, which has actually discouraged people from trying to understand how this stuff works, right? Because the issue of enslavement that was just raised is partly related to the ignorance that people have about how these things work. You know, for them it's kind of like magical. This machine can like answer these problems before I can even think about them, right? And so people then become stupefied. But if people actually understood, you know, how the algorithms work, how the machines work, right, then they, in a sense, they could become empowered. They could, Douglas Rushkoff talks about program or be programmed, right? So this is a call for people to understand, to learn, right, and not just assume this stuff is just going to come ready-made for you. Right, so you have to move away from the Apple ethic, basically. Steve Jobs, man, you want to talk about someone who did evil. The whole user-friendly ethic, that is the thing that, in a sense, has led us to this point.
To some extent, you could say that we want the cyborg to make the cyborg's parts and understand, why am I getting this arm? And truly understand why you might choose a particular arm. Because that arm will, regardless of whether it's natural or artificial, embody that person well.
Exactly. Let me ask this question. Do you think man becoming cyborgs is inevitable?
I mean, ultimately, I mean, we have to remember that we are the subjects. So we are the ones, in one sense, in charge of our own destiny. So if we want to become that, that's where we're going. If we want to say, no, I want to be fully human, then that's where we're going. Because, yeah, we can, nothing is inevitable. I mean, we are in control in one sense, I mean, to a certain extent, but we make the decisions with our day-to-day actions. And so, yeah, we can choose the path that we want for the future. And so nothing is already set in stone. There's a lot of factors that lead us towards a certain kind of decision-making and towards some kind of life, but we can always choose differently. And that's the freedom of the human person. That's the complete freedom of the, like when we talk about just because my parents were alcoholics and I have a huge tendency to become an alcoholic doesn't mean I have to be an alcoholic. It will be more difficult than somebody that did not have that predisposition, but I can always choose differently.
But can I challenge you on that? Because let's say the mobile market. Did we choose to allow the mobile phone to become an extension of ourselves, or did it just come about? And then what we did is learn to adapt to it.
I think we did choose. In some sense, we saw the temptation and we fell for it, but we can learn from our mistakes. That's the other important part of you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think this is kind of a complicated question, and one way to think about it is in terms of, again, looking at the history of technology. So, for example, automobiles radically transformed the human condition. However, I'm someone who never learned how to drive, and I live perfectly well. I travel around the world and all the rest of it. Now, the issue is going to be, in the case of cyborgs, okay, that this technology is probably going to happen. There's probably going to be very significant merging of some sort, much more than what we see at the moment. The question is whether it'll be possible to still be a human being if you don't do that. Right, so the issue is how elective will this be? Because because there are certain technologies that have had mass uptake, but still it's been possible to live without it, right, and be treated as an ordinary normal person. But I think with this kind of technology, given its intimate connection with the nature of the person, it's a trickier matter. And unless you actually have states and religions and these kind of superordinate authorities really getting on top of this, right, you can end up just leading to a kind of not only speciation, but greater inequality and a much more unstable world.